So in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the practical that you can expect in January. You'll be given the date through Moodle. It'll be sent out through by admin. Either Kathleen will send it to you, or maybe IT faculty, I'm not too sure, but it'll be January anyway. The weight of this practical is 50%, so it's quite heavy. But this is to replace a normal exam that you would normally have. It'll be a closed book, whereas this is an open book. It's a 2.5 hour exam. You'll be given a sample site randomly allocated from alternative versions, so you can't share code or answers that way. Okay, at least that's to try and prevent it. So please bear that in mind, that if it can be kind of identified if you're sharing code. Okay, it's not so much code but answers based on other sites. So you'll be asked to identify any potential security flaws. So everything that is covered in these slides you will be expected to be kind of to know and be able to identify. So you need to include the following. So you'll be given a site, a hosted site. Okay, you'll be given a web address and you need to access that site, and you look at the site and you'll do what based on what's covered in these slides to see if there's anything in it that you think might be flawed. Okay, that's the first thing. So but just by looking at the site without even looking at the code, that would be one aspect. And then you'll also be given the code, and you will have to look at the code to say, I identify here that there's no password hashing being used or whatever, and so you can identify that and mention it in here. Okay, so a submission, there will be a text box essentially where you type in your answer to say, these are my suggested implementations to address the security flaws in the given sample site. In this case here, no code is necessary. Okay, you can identify certain areas. You can say there's no hashing, there's no. So if you mention things that are actually in the site that could have a negative impact on your answer, or negative marking, or reduced marking, because otherwise you could essentially just name off everything listed in here. Okay, so just be careful, it has to be accurate. So if there is a section that is using encryption, for example, in the passwords, then you shouldn't mention that there should be encryption. You should be able to identify that there actually is. Okay, then you will be given the code, as I mentioned, and you either talk about certain aspects of the code in this answer here, right? You can be very specific with your answer in that sense, or you may want to identify it in the code itself and say and add extra lines of code to improve the security. So if you notice over here, for example, we previously what we have looked at is I've just changed this a little bit to make it a little bit more clear. So I've given code sample 1, code sample 2. So we had one example, which is this one here. This is the website example, PHP in the database. That was the first one we looked at, and it has the private and public folder, so that's a secure thing as well. So that's better organization. Okay, so we mentioned that in the slides. And if you go to login, for example, you can see nowhere is hashing being used, so it is kind of clear from this that there is no hashed passwords in our database. Okay, so you might, if you can identify that and say, okay, well, that's missing. Okay, and you don't have to specify specifically where. Now if you can identify at this line you need to have some kind of hashing or encoding, then obviously that's going to gain a lot of marks. Okay, so any code based answer is going to gain top marks, and if you can't identify which lines, then you can be generic about your answer and put it in here. So you can still gain the marks, but it might not gain as good as someone who's given both a generic description and also being very specific. Okay, do remember it is an open book exam, so you can use Google, you can use these sample files, and you can use whatever you want really to be able to identify this. So again, it should be clear that this site here is not secure. Okay, and to make it a little bit easier, it's not easier but more clear for you. So I'm going to just put that in with it, that this is not secure and this is secure. Okay, so the next time you see that, so this should be secure. Sorry, not secure. So this is not secure, and this is secure. Okay, now there is some, and this here is secure. There is some parts missing or lacking in its in the Tutorial Republic based on what I have here. The code itself looks good, but I've set this up quickly in class, and you can see here, for example, there's no public or private folder, so a recommendation will be to put these files into a public and private structure similar to this. So that's just an example. Okay, so you'll be given the code, you identify and see where you can improve the security. No, this is important. Okay, so not to think that this task is impossible, because you only need to put snippets of code to show that it would improve the security. You don't have to have this actually working. Okay, there's not enough time in the practical exam to get it fully working, so you will not be required to get this fully function, and an outline of improved code is sufficient. Okay, now a couple of things then, a couple of questions that came through. I think that's more or less everything. Just looking at the questions from earlier, I think that's more or less everything identified. Okay, the question was, do we have the code? If you can provide code, that would be better. Yeah. Okay.